So to wrap up our conference, we're going to talk about anxiety, de-escalation, and stress reduction techniques, Dr. Ball and Dr. Lyons. Dr. Ball is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSF and a licensed psychologist at the Star Center. For the past 14 years, she has worked in several clinical and research settings, conducting diagnostic assessments and providing individualized and group-based treatment to children and adults with ASD. Her research and clinical work center around understanding the strengths and challenges of adults with ASD, and she has a specific interest in working with children and adults who are minimally verbal. And Dr. Lyons has a very short bio here. He is a behavior analyst and a researcher at the Star Center. So welcome, both of you. Wrap it up.
Thank you. So I'm Greg, and Dr. Ball will be presenting the second half, and it is Friday, almost evening, end of the conference, and so everyone's own anxiety and stress should be feeling reduced at this point. Okay, so we have three objectives today in our talk. The first is to couch anxiety and stress responses in the literature on challenging behavior interventions and strategies. And in doing so, then present a very useful evidence-based framework for problem-solving challenging behavior and stress anxiety responses. And that's commonly known as positive behavior intervention and supports, which is a function-based multi-component assessment, planning, and practice process. And then finally, Dr. Ball will extend these strategies into cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety. So challenging behavior tends to be the thing we think of when stress and anxiety are indicated. The definition of challenging behavior tends to be pretty broad. And it means interference with learning or socialization or pro-social activities. And so these behaviors then interfere with those pro-social opportunities. Okay. So let's ground it then in a case example, and this draws on some recent examples from my own clinical experience. And so Saul is a 12-year-old who uses phrase speech. Saul's parents note that he gets stressed easily when he is in new or less familiar places. He also expresses his need for sameness by becoming upset and or avoidant. He'll either melt down or shut down. He gets very anxious when something is different or does not go as expected. Oftentimes this results in him running off, commonly known as eloping. His mother also explained that he becomes anxious when his dad wears button-down t-shirts and will scream until dad removes the shirt. I can't make this up. This is true. So these types of challenges, they found, are more likely to happen if he misses a meal, so he's hungry, does not sleep through the night, or had to deal with a stressor earlier on in the day. These setting events essentially make him less tolerant. So the behavior analyst collaborated with Saul's parents to clarify the topography of these behaviors, what they actually look like, the associated environment variables, what happens before and after these events, and then finally, what are the behavior functions? And so I'm going to go through discussing what it means to indicate what the topography is, to analyze the environmental variables, and then come up with a suspected function. There are four basic broad primary functions we think of when we think of challenging behaviors. And those are, and those functions then tell us about how we plan our multi-component behavior support plans. Multi-component behavior support plans include prevention strategies, teaching strategies where we teach coping responses or communicative replacement skills, and then finally, how do we manage consequences? What happens after those anxiety or stress responses or challenging behaviors occur? Positive behavior supports grew out of the field of applied behavior analysis, but there's a focus on positive prevention, positive and preventative practices, and developing a very reinforcement-rich environment for individuals. There's a reduced role of punishment and probably even no role, and no aversive stimuli. Positive behavior interventions and supports are based on functions, which I'll talk about in a second, and multi-component planning. That is, plans that include many strategies at once. Positive behavior support emphasizes ecologically valid and generalizable results. So parents, teachers are involved in implementing these strategies. It's not just an expert clinician. We want our interventions to be acceptable and feasible by stakeholders, and collaboratively developed. So it's not just me going in developing a plan, it's me going in and developing a plan closely with parents and teachers. It's person-centered, and finally, and probably most importantly, it's evidence-based in the research literature, and it's driven by data in the field. So why does challenging behavior occur? So behavior is often communication. I'm sure you guys have heard this. And kids with developmental disabilities and individuals with developmental disabilities often have limited communication social repertoires, which can contribute to stress and anxiety and challenging behavior. And so the job of the positive behavior support team is to figure out what the function is, so why it occurs or what the purpose of it is, and not immediately assume stress or anxiety, although often that would be the case. And there are two broad categories of function, and the first category is to obtain, to get something, or to keep something. And then the second broad category is to avoid or escape. And when we think of anxiety responses, it's particularly around avoidance or escaping a situation. Let's skip here. There's a nice acronym for helping us remember 4 basic functions that fall under those 2 other functions. So we talked about escape or avoidance. And then the other 3 are to obtain. So to obtain attention, to obtain something tangible or an event, and then finally sensory, which would be automatic or non-socially mediated functions. So our mnemonic is EATS, and these are broad categories and can be broken down into smaller categories. But these are important because knowing whether it's escape or attention or tangible or sensory helps us build our multi-component plans. And it's much more informative than simply indicating stress or anxiety. So functional behavior assessments at this point have become well diffused into the community, although they're not always implemented in the best way. So I'm going to cover them really quickly so we can get to the strategies. Functional behavior assessments help us identify those 4 functions: escape, attention, tangible, and sensory. It's data-driven. We take lots of data, and I'll go over what those data are. And they tend to be implemented by a BCBA, a board-certified behavior analyst, or psychologist, or a professional with expertise in FBA. So although teachers and parents and caregivers and natural change agents are the focus of positive behavior intervention and supports, it really needs to be conducted with a qualified health and educational professional, such as a BCBA. Again, these are used to then develop the behavior support plan, helping us understand why, helps us then plan and treat. There are 2 basic categories of data. The first are direct data, and these are the preferred data and used in conjunction with indirect and informant data. We collect data on what happens before and after challenging events. We collect data on when it's happening, so that's a scatter plot. I'll show you that in a second. We take data on frequency of the challenging behavior and duration of the challenging behavior, how long it goes on. And then if needed, we do what's called a functional analysis, which is an experimental paradigm that helps us clarify what the function is. And then this is informed and buttressed by functional assessment interviews, as well as FBA scales and screeners. And this is the one I'd recommend, the functional assessment screening tool, which is readily available online for free. Has the best reliability with more rigorous functional analyses methodology. This is what the FAST looks like. It's pretty fast to fill out. This is an example of scatterplots. Scatterplots are very useful and underutilized. Often I suggest we conduct a scatterplot when I hear my child is always stressed, my child is always anxious, my daughter is always hitting herself or others. And while it may seem like, well, in this case, George is always throwing books, there's actually a few times where he's not or is less likely. And that can help us understand those environmental variables around why it's happening, which is the function of the behavior. And this is probably the most important tool. It's called an ABC analysis, where we look at the date, time, the setting, the context, but most importantly, what happens before, the antecedent, and what happens after, the consequence. And consequence doesn't mean a punishment, it just means what happens after the behavior. And then that helps us understand what the function is, why it's happening. Is it to escape? Is it to obtain attention? Is it to obtain something? Or is it for sensory purposes? And once we figure out those antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, and the settings, the setting events that make challenging behavior or stress responses or anxiety more or less likely, we can conduct a pattern analysis, hypothesize what the function is, and inform our behavior support plan. And this is what broadly what a behavior support plan should include. It should include those antecedents and strategies related to the antecedents. And those tend to be preventative strategies, proactive preventative strategies, not waiting for that stress response to occur. Behavior teaching or replacement skill strategies, and then finally, consequence management. And remember, we're in the realm of positive behavior supports, so we're going to focus on reinforcement strategies. These are some prominent, well-researched, evidence-based prevention strategies, and I've grouped them into 4 different areas. Avoiding and altering setting events and triggers, and clarifying expectation and predictability. So this really helps with rigidity and need for sameness, and I find that most people get this, and there's different ways to help with that. People tend to use schedules very well, checklists, and foreshadowing and warning. So in the case of Saul, if an event is going to change in his daily routine, what could his teacher do? Perhaps foreshadow the change, right? Warn of the change. Put the change within the activity schedule. And this could help then avoid a stressful situation for Saul. Priming pre-exposure is also really helpful. So if Saul doesn't like going to new places, how can we help make that new place less stressful and less anxiety-provoking? Well, we could explore the place under less demanding situations or practice under less demanding situations. So birthday parties is a common situation that could lead to stress or anxiety for individuals with developmental disabilities. And so maybe we practice under really fun parameters, birthday party. Or if a child is going to go to a new school, then we might go to the school without kids there and walk around the school and have our favorite snack in the snack area or the cafeteria. And so we're developing nice positive associations through that pre-exposure priming in the new situation. And then first then can be used in different ways, simply to say, okay, first we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. But it could also be done in a motivating way, where first we're going to do something not so fun, and then we're going to do something fun. And that could also help with altering those setting events or triggers and clarifying expectation and predictability. Another preventative strategy is increasing understanding. So social stories, social narratives are really helpful for that. If you can make them fun and motivating and incorporate preferred interests, then that's helpful as well. Role-playing and modeling. So in the case of the birthday party, you might role-play that. So that role-play being the person whose birthday it is, or be an attendee at a birthday party. When it comes to anxiety, especially, gradual approaches such as systematic desensitization or systematic fading and gradual demand exposure are really helpful. Systematic fading is simply taking a situation that's easy and taking a situation that's hard and slowly combining them so that the hard situation becomes easy. And again, this should be done in consultation with a behavior analyst. And then gradual demand exposure. So oftentimes in instruction in schools or demands placed on kids at home or individuals at home, we may want to start with demands that are easier, right? And then build success before we get to demands that are harder. And so that gradual process is really helpful. And then finally, altering and control and motivation, building in choices and preferences, and helps alter the motivational parameters of situations that could be stressful. So if a child has stress around letters and numbers identification, maybe embedding those in tasks that are fun would be an initial step for helping overcome that anxiety and stress around letters and numbers. Skill teaching. So now we're on the B, and so usually we're thinking about teaching behaviors or coping responses, or functionally equivalent communicative replacement behaviors. This is really important for stress or anxiety related responses. So to take the case of Saul wanting his father to not wear a button shirt. And Saul goes directly to screaming and tantruming and throwing. We might first want to just teach Saul to tell his father nicely to change his shirt. Okay, so that would be a functionally equivalent communicative replacement behavior. We'd also teach Saul then coping and calming down strategies, and I'll get to that in a second when we talk about desensitization. But there are many coping and calming strategies that could be developed, but I would suggest you individualize them. Some kids don't like deep breathing, some kids don't like music, and so on. So those are individualized for the child. I just worked with a kid where in our social story, one of our coping responses was to go listen to Taylor Swift's "Shake It Off," and he just has a lot of fun with that. Embedded in there is, well, we're shaking it off. Increasing related skill competencies. So for example, if the kid, for the kid that has stress or anxiety around letters and numbers, if we build skill there motivationally, that could also help reduce some of that stress. And then I threw under here practicing and reinforcing behavioral flexibility because it's very important. And in the case of Saul and his dad wearing the button-up shirt, it really comes down to that flexibility and rigidity. And I'll tell you what we did about that, because I know we're on our edge of our seats. And so we did a gradual exposure and systematic desensitization paradigm, where we started with actually embedding reinforcers too. And so there's two things we want to think about when we do this process. Again, is building a hierarchy that's really gradual, and so kids never really get very uncomfortable. And then secondly is building in a competing reinforcer, which functions as a distractor and incompatibility with a stress or anxiety response. This has been around for a long time, but is really helpful even outside of phobias. So it was started in phobias and anxiety, but could also be helpful for treating rigidity and inflexibility in kids with developmental disabilities. So we started with just the dad coming in with the shirt in his hand, and inside the pocket was what? A competing reinforcer. It was the delivery of fire trucks and bubbles and candy and all sorts of fun things. And slowly but surely, we made our way up the hierarchy to where dad had partially the shirt on. Again, coming in each time with something new in his pocket. And then finally, the shirt was buttoned up, and dad came in with a new item, and dad was able to stay for a while in the room while they played bubbles together, and we increased that amount of time. And then the next step for that is generalizing it, and that's what they're working on now. The gradual exposure and systematic desensitization paradigm is really, really helpful for addressing anxiety and stress in individuals with developmental disabilities. And then finally, motivational systems are really helpful. I think most of us are familiar with token economies, or I don't want to say star charts because that term is a little overused and a bit of a misnomer, but token economies help motivate our kids through stressful or anxiety-provoking situations. But a nice elaboration to token economies is self-monitoring and self-management. And in these processes, not only are there token economies in place, but we're teaching kids to self-evaluate their own behavior, gain a self-awareness of their own behavior, and self-reinforce. And this is important because when we start thinking about self-monitoring and self-evaluation and self-awareness, not only are we targeting specific stress or anxiety responses, but we're also targeting self-regulation, a broader, more generalizable skill area, which we know is really important to develop in all individuals, and particularly individuals with developmental disabilities. I do want to mention that I went through some prevention, behavior, and consequence management strategies in about 10 minutes. There are many of these, many helpful strategies, and a behavior analyst could help practitioners and teachers select those. There are two areas of research I just want to point out in positive behavior support. So PBS has been around for decades now. ABA has been around for even more decades now. But recently, as of 2015, there was the first rigorous large-scale randomized control trial which elaborated on these data. And it was parents that were the implementers of these positive behavior support strategies. And there's some now really nice rigorous data on these types of strategies that I just shared with you. And then Dr. Entz had mentioned this, but at UCSF and our Parenting Together series, we're looking at the use of optimistic parenting, which is developed by Dr. Durand at the University of South Florida, that helps parents and teachers build their optimism around parenting and teaching, because we know that over time, high degrees of pessimism can make their way into our lives, their lives, and that could interfere with the learning and implementation of these strategies. And so there's some of the research that we're doing at UCSF that is piggybacking on the work of Dr. Durand. So now I'm going to invite Dr. Ball up to help extend extend our strategy into CBT for anxiety.
Hi, everyone. I know we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to go through things pretty quickly, but I think there's a lot of information in your slides, and we'll have a little bit of time for discussion and questions at the end. But so CBT, or cognitive behavioral strategies, is based on the idea that there's a feedback loop between our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings. So a really classic example is someone has an anxiety about bridges, and so they feel anxious about bridges because they have this thought that if they're on top of a bridge, it could fall down and they could die. And so, because they have this anxiety, this motivates their behavior, which is to avoid bridges at all costs. And because they avoid bridges, they never have the opportunity to really see that when they're on a bridge, it can be okay, and not all bridges are going to fall down. And so this then develops into a feedback loop in which, every time they see a bridge, they feel a little more anxious, and, they remember this thought that, perhaps I could die if this bridge falls down, and so they continue to avoid bridges, and it, sometimes stems into avoidance of other things, that they have these sort of what we think of as distorted thoughts that are motivating their anxieties. So CBT has two components primarily that's looking at trying to address these different anxieties, one of which is the behavioral components, which incorporate a lot of the same kinds of strategies that Greg just talked to you about, and then the other piece is really trying to get at what are those distorted thoughts, and finding ways to modify those beliefs in order to allow individuals to reduce their anxiety, and sort of take more control over the things that they're fear of. CBT is very present focused, so for individuals who are engaging in CBT, you're not going to go through a lot of background history, and certainly this is very different than psychodynamic therapy, where you spend a lot of time talking about families and maybe where some of these anxieties stemmed from, though certainly that could be important in the development of distorted thoughts. It's time limited, so most CBT programs are somewhere between 10 and 16 weeks, and it's very problem-solving oriented. So one of the first things that you do in many CBT programs is identify what are the specific anxieties or fears that you or that the child has, and you really focus on addressing very specific things in treatment, with the hopes that those skills that you learn in addressing specific fears will also generalize. Let's see. Okay, so there are several CBT programs that have been researched a little bit for children and adolescents, particularly with ASD. So there are three different types of programs that are used. Individual treatment programs, so mostly, a child sitting with a psychologist in a one-on-one session, or a social worker. Certainly all individual therapy with children should also incorporate their parents. And so examples of this program, there's or these kinds of individual treatments. There's the BIACA program by Jeff Wood and colleagues down at UCLA, and then the Coping Cat, which was not developed for children with autism, was developed for children with more sort of general anxieties by Kendall, and has been starting to be more widely used with kids with autism. There's a group-based intervention called Facing Your Fears by Judy Reaven that's had a little bit of research. And then there's some combined programs that include both individual components as well as the group-based components. So Exploring Feelings by Tony Atwood in Australia. And then there's a multimodal anxiety and social skills intervention by Susan White. And so I'll talk just a little bit about a couple of the programs that have had a little more research. So the Coping Cat, I think, is one of the most widely used child CBT programs, certainly outside of autism, but I think has gained increasing traction in a lot of autism clinics. It's very user-friendly. It's also very inexpensive, which I think is, two important things when we're thinking about clinical services anywhere, but particularly out in the community. So, again, these are individual sessions with the child, often incorporating the family. And the first 8 weeks really focus on teaching skills, and the last 8 weeks focus on implementing those skills, both in the session as well as homework in the home. And so I'm not going to read through all the different elements, but I think important things And common elements that you'll see across programs is really trying to help children to identify their feelings, both the physiological components as well as, the antecedents, or, what are triggering the thoughts or the anxious feelings. And then also developing specific coping plans. So Greg kind of alluded to some of this. Sometimes it's specific coping strategies like breathing or distractions, but particularly in CBT programs, it's also about modifying those distorted thoughts. So coming up with little scripts or modifying what they call self-talk. So if you have this feeling that the bridge is going to fall down when you're on it, being able to sort of rationalize with yourself and talk yourself through that you have no evidence that the bridge is going to fall down, or that, this bridge has never fallen down despite being, up for several decades or whatever that might be. And then particularly important, I think, is the practice or the exposure component. And for the coping cat specifically, you have a fear hierarchy. So you develop with the child all the different things that they might be afraid of, and you sort of then put them in order from least to most. And you really start, when you start to do the practice and the exposure, you start with those smaller things, the things that they can envision potentially tolerating, and then you build up to those fears that are more challenging for them. The BIACA program, I have the 7 to 13-year-old range in red because I think they're also developing an adolescent program now. Just so you guys know, this is not yet publicly available. I've been told that it's with the publishers in some various stage, so hopefully we'll see it soon. I think there's been a fair amount of research by this particular research group, and I think the hopeful thing about this is it's been specifically designed for children with autism. So it incorporates a lot of the similar strategies and approaches that the coping cat does, but it also incorporates some supplementary social skills training, so to address the specific needs of children with autism. And then also, they've really thought through the reward process, sort of what Greg was alluding to. And so moving beyond something like a token economy to really think about what are the child's sort of special interests, and being able to capitalize on those to motivate change. Facing Your Fears, again, is a group program, including both parent and child components. And so, sometimes people, I think, it seems really obvious why parents should be involved in any kind of child or individual child therapy. But I wanted to actually use an example. I was thinking about, with Greg's case. So, for example, Saul doesn't like Dad to wear button-down shirts. And let's say Saul has the verbal skills to tell us that, that's because he thinks something bad's going to happen to his dad when he wears a button-down shirt. Okay, so we can address that distorted thought, but this has motivated his behavior to then have a tantrum, right? Which then motivates Dad's behavior to take the shirt off, because as a parent, if all you have to do is take off your shirt to prevent a tantrum that, at 9 o'clock in the morning you're trying to get out the door, that seems like a reasonable thing. You could put your shirt on in the car. However, this is where it starts, right? And I mean, any of you who are parents of young children, you know these things about, behavior and parenting, and certainly it gets harder and harder to manage as your children get older, and particularly for children and adolescents with autism. These behavioral displays get stronger, they're more difficult to manage. And so part of the importance of including parents in the intervention is also to help them see how their child's anxieties and fears are motivating the parents' behavior, and making sure that we also get the parents to be motivated to change with the child. And then I think the last program I have is Exploring Feelings. So this is a really short program, and it's also a group-based intervention, and I think has been shown a little bit of success in a few schools. And so I highlight this just because I think, sometimes we need shorter programs that can address larger numbers of children in different kinds of settings. And I think Atwood has talked about this not necessarily being, having to be driven by a psychologist, but, certainly someone who has experience in child development and working with children with autism. And so, I talked a little bit common elements of CBT programs. There are many of the behavioral components that Greg referred to, and really what is what is emphasized, or maybe what is a little bit different about CBT, is that cognitive restructuring, identifying what are the sort of irrational thoughts and being able to modify those. And all of these programs also include the range of different coping strategies, some exposure, some kind of hierarchy, whether it be different types of fears that are more or less anxiety-provoking, or one fear in a sort of graded exposure. So as Greg was talking about, Dad having only one arm of the shirt on, and working up to the shirt being fully on and buttoned. And then the other, common elements are that are particularly important for children with autism are things like multimodal teaching. So using lots of different visual supports, sometimes social stories, sometimes video models, role play, and certainly reward systems. So I'm not going to kind of bore you too much with the science, but I think it's important to know that there have not been a lot of studies, actually, considering that I just talked about 5 or 6 different types of programs. There have been 12 randomized control treatment trials and 2 open trials across 11 different types of intervention programs, all with some kind of CBT component. 4 of them were on the Biaka study, 2 on the Exploring Feelings. A lot of people mentioned their own sort of flavor of the coping cat, so a lot of variability despite the different common elements. But CBT did seem to be superior to treatment as usual or their waitlist control groups. The effect sizes or how useful that was for a given group was really driven by one single study, and so that's kind of what pushed it into the headlines that you see in the news. But even without that study, there was some benefit, and so I think one of the things that Dr. Leventhal mentioned earlier is there's a lot of variability in those groups, right? So we report a lot of group effects on different interventions, but that's it's reduced a bit by the fact that some children aren't making a lot of change, and a couple children might get worse. And so even if you have some children who are getting a lot better, you may not necessarily see that in these group-based trials. And I think one thing to just think about as clinicians, if you're thinking about using evidence-based research, there's not a lot of studies, but also these are pretty limited in terms of the scope of the samples that they're serving. So they've focused almost exclusively on school-age kids, a few adolescents, and these are primarily children with average or above average IQs and language abilities, which is necessary given the types of skills that CBT is focusing on. Okay, and I think that's all, and we didn't do too bad on time.